Hey everyone, we're kicking off today with John Cutler, a product evangelist at Amplitude and the author of the blog Cuttlefish. I'm saying that right, John?
Yeah, I mean, right. It's cuttlefish. It's my name, Cutle fish.
Per-
The actual cuttlefish has two
yeah,
T's.
and that's
So,
where I wanted to make sure we got that
yeah.
pronunciation right. Can you tell us a little bit more about your role as a product evangelist at Amplitude? I think that's there's kind of an interpretation of what that role actually does, but I think the way that you actually operate at Amplitude might be a little bit different than the normal
Yeah,
evangelist.
it is a bit different, and we've struggled even with the title. I mean, a typical product evangelist is talking about the product almost all the time, very active in communities, answering questions. And I think that my role is focused a little bit on the surrounding culture, systems, I guess, process, different things related to teams being more impact focused. So we believe as a company that if those things fall into place, then the product is just a natural fit. So we certainly have people internally who do talk about the product a lot and teach people about the product and teach people how specifically to use it or specific features. We have a product marketing team that gets very into how specific features can help you do specific things. One thing we've noticed as a company is we sort of deal with a cross section of product teams everywhere. I mean, in an average week, I'm talking to 10 or 20 teams, ranging from a Microsoft or Alexa team, to like a big bank or big healthcare, organization. So when you talk to that many teams, you realize that for a lot of organizations, this is all incredibly new. So it's even more important for us to focus on some of these key foundational aspects of how teams work or how they plan or how they do various things so that our product can just find its natural place in the organization. So that's our little spin on being a product evangelist. It is fair to mention there's a lot of like DevOps product evangelists who do what I do and get deep into the product as well,
Mhm.
but it just happens to be my role that I focus a lot more on the sort of surrounding systems.
Got it. So would you say it's fair to kind of articulate that role as almost like a, I don't want to say product consultant, but you help teams actually run like product teams and drive towards
Yeah, and
outcomes
it's kind
better?
of funny because I've been a consultant in the past, so I almost have the best of being a consultant without um, all the stress of being a consultant.
Sure.
I mean, I get to meet with a team for maybe an hour or 2 hours, or run a small workshop with them, and I take sort of the Jeff Patton approach to workshops. Jeff Patton does these user story mapping
Hmm.
workshops that are incredibly valuable to teams. I mean, he'll do those for a day or two, and you'll hear the team talking about it a year later. It's kind of transformational to do that. And he described it to me as kind of dropping a little optional knowledge bomb on the team and making it accessible. And then, if the team goes for it, great. And if not, well, there might be some other stuff at play. So that's kind of my role, either through writing or through workshops or being active on Twitter or these other things, is to just kind of offer up ideas. And if people are interested in trying them, that's great. And if not, that's okay too. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't have the stress of the first week it all being great, and then the next week the CEO is like, damn it, why are you trying to change everything about how we're working? Like, I don't have to deal with that
No,
exactly.
that's nice. I think one thing that I often see in your writing is a very honest approach to kind of describing the life of a product manager. I think it's maybe a challenge that a lot of people have. I definitely hear this at product conferences where you get together with other product managers and they say, "Oh God, I'm not the only one going through this."
Right, right, right.
Is it normal to be as messy outside the ivory tower as it kind of feels like it
Oh
is?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even at those places, I mean, even I've met with many of the teams that write the blog posts that everyone looks at and they say, oh my God, if we could just work like Intercom or something like that, or, whoever. And it's hard. It's really, really, really hard all the time. There's no, in fact, the safer you make things and the more transparent you make things and the more you actually focus on outcomes, the harder it gets, right? It's actually easier in many ways to just be like, all right, we shipped the feature, or okay, we read this book and we're going to copy exactly how they work. It's a lot harder in the real world. And also, I mean, anytime you get professionals from different sort of craft areas together, there's going to be tension and there's going to be a culture clash. And so it is hard all the time, everywhere. And I've always done these funny activities. I got to do this great activity where we had a customer conference, and we had prospects there too, but we had sort of 140 people from 100 companies. And they were all in one room, and I had an activity where I had them describe an experiment that worked in the last, couple quarters and an experiment that didn't work. And it was the exact same things. It would be like, oh, we tried OKRs. Oh, OKRs tanked, or, oh, we, tried to copy Spotify. Next person's like, oh, we copied Spotify and it didn't work out. Or, we tried to start together on initiatives. And the other team was like, well, that was too hard. We couldn't do it. And so it was kind of very telling that, like, you get all these people together and you talk about the real world, and it's very messy and it's very context dependent. It's like the same thing that starts working one year, the next year stops working, or the thing that didn't work last year can now work. A good example of that is like a lot of large banks, et cetera, want to adopt product thinking. So they get really excited about product thinking. And some consultant has told them, you have to adopt product thinking. And so suddenly there's, there's 1,000 POs running around this huge building or whatever. And there's internal products and internal customers and all that kind of stuff. There's checking account number 1 product and checking account number 2 product and, mobile front end product or something. And, so that it's good. And initially it's kind of great. And they start thinking about these things as product. But then a couple of years later, the internal teams are like, you know what? This internal customer isn't our customer. Like, our customers out there in the world, we want more. We want to have more sense of impact. We want to do more things. So what got them there isn't what's going to take them to the next level to do that. So you really, I never thought I would get, I sort of feel like I'm in the Matrix when you talk to so many teams, but like once you do, you realize like, wow, this is a mess.
Well, one thing that doesn't vary a whole lot in what I've seen you write is the focus on actual outcomes versus, shipping for shipping's sake. And I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit more about how teams can focus on doing that and kind of how they can structure their work to focus on more actual outcomes.
Well, first of all, it's really hard. I mean, I think that's the underlying message, that it's easy to say it. It's very like logically coherent if I say to you, oh, wouldn't it be better if we focused on outcomes? Now, I always remember a CEO saying, they said, look, I've read your writing, but, no shit, right? Like, you think I don't want outcomes? You think I don't want the business to do well in the long term? You think I don't want this stuff to work? And, but how? How do you get this stuff going? Yeah. And so I think that at its root, I take the kind of maker's angle that we all want to feel impact in our work. We all want to feel like the stuff we're doing, and our sweat and tears is going towards making a difference. And so, what that means in context for different teams could be very different. Like I've used this term lately, like, what does a high functioning feature factory look like? and for the reality is that for some companies, the idea of having a steady stream of reasonably usable features shipped would be an amazing improvement.
Sure.
Like that would be an incredible improvement.
Yeah.
And then the team that got used to that would start wondering like, well, these are all pretty good, but could we have made better decisions? Could we have had a little bit more of an outcome or, doing that? So anyway, I think what I'm trying to say is that it's more of like an aspiration and like a mindset about how you're working versus, everything you're doing being an A/B test or everything you're doing having 100% certainty that it worked or, having beautiful leading indicators for everything. Because again, back to going to this messy idea, it's really hard to get that. It's really hard, there's certain domains where you get this like A/B experiment, you can test everything. But frankly, a lot of times that's just algorithmic optimization. You're just kind of optimizing a known product experience to be slightly better. Yeah. You're not looking at a step change. You're not looking at making the strategy a lot better. So to tie it back to your question, I am kind of obsessed with that theme. My main angle is I think that people should feel impact in their work, and they do better work when they can feel impact in their work. I think there's a lot of waste in product development, where, we don't reflect on our decisions and did they have an intended impact. But I also think that you can also drive in data circles too, like there's the flip side of hippo decision making and all that is an environment where there's no room to take risks. Everything needs to be proven. If you don't have the data, you can't even try something. It's all very like leading in, deterministic and leading indicators. So I don't know. Those are some thoughts around that. I've got a lot of thoughts on it, but I do focus a lot on it, and it's a pretty nuanced topic for sure.
How do you balance those different environments? Now that you bring it up, I think I've definitely heard both ends of the spectrum from people.
Yeah.
And there's kind of the paralysis by analysis where people are just kind of looking at data too
Right,
much.
right.
They can't get anything done. How would you break out of that cycle if you were in either of those environments?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I do with teams is I try to get them to understand that if there's no uncertainty, they probably don't have a business. Like, if you're in a business that's 100% certain, if you have proof of everything, and it was easy for you to get that proof, then it probably means that someone else is able to get that proof,
Sure.
right? And so what I try to, that's one of the techniques I use at first, is like trying to embrace uncertainty and thinking about uncertainty as a positive thing, versus a negative thing in your environment. And the net effect of that to the ends of the spectrum that you mentioned, that is, the person who needs to prove everything to the nth degree realizes like, wow, maybe if I can prove it to the nth degree, it means that we aren't really tackling the right problem. And the hippo decision maker realizes that, like, typically in there, let's just say you have a CEO say, build exactly this. Typically there's a lot of nested beliefs in that. They're not dumb, they've got this idea of what they want to do. And once you frame it as like, wow, that's an interesting idea. How could we reduce, I'm not going to say your bet is wrong,
Sure.
but how could we reduce uncertainty here to the right amount? How could we reflect on your decision making? And that's one of the key problems I see, is that people lump together, whether or not in your company you make prescriptive bets or not, or do teams work on features or not, they couple that together with, do you reflect on your decision making? And I'll give you an example. Like in a startup with a CEO knows a lot about the business or whatever, is it inherently bad for them to say, build this, build this, build this, build this, build this? Probably not. What would be inherently bad would be if they never reflected on whether their decision quality was good. So that's an environment where it's like top-down decision-making. Is it bad? I don't know. I wouldn't want to work there, but I can't say that it's really bad. But what would be really bad is they don't have any mechanism to understand the quality of their bets. And so that's what I would leave you with, is that to me, the balance between those two worlds is trying to create a world where having a prescriptive idea isn't inherently bad, but you're going to reflect on the quality of your decisions, and not having all the information you need isn't bad either. I think not, yeah. But you're just you'll reflect, you'll try something and then reflect to see if you're reducing uncertainty. So I think that to me, that's the balance, like the logical balance between those two things.
Yeah. And I think that's a good kind of segue into the conversation about the North Star playbook, which is something that you helped author. And I think that almost seems like a good mechanism for reflecting on action, right? Because you actually have a number to do that. Can you share a little bit more about what inspired the North Star playbook?
Yeah, I mean, the Amplitude had run a bunch of workshops, and they'd experimented with some different workshop ideas. And one of them was based loosely on this. It's not a new idea. I mean, it's this idea of, creating a tree or a map of inputs and outputs, or leading indicators and lagging indicators. And you pick one North Star metric that sort of encapsulates your key value that your product can provide. So Amplitude's North Star, for example, is weekly learning users, which tells you a lot. Like, we're not a generalized BI tool. We're about teams working together, that you have to learn. It's not about just running a report and getting the answer you need so you can show your boss that particular thing. And so that's your North Star metric, but you have a series of inputs that feed into that, and sort of creates a kind of tree. And the idea is that if you focus on those inputs, you'll have a positive impact on the North Star. And if you have a positive impact on the North Star, it will contribute to like sustainable long-term product-led growth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not short-term stuff, but you know, you'll build the foundation of a really like product leading the growth of your particular product, which is interesting. So that's the basic idea. And why I say it's not new is, you know, the idea of linking together inputs and outputs is not new. So we started to do those workshops, and it really seemed to especially if you imagine like in the early, you know, 2011 or 2012, it's kind of growth hacking was really popular, and startups are typically really obsessed with these metrics, like, you know, very like pirate metrics or specific, you know, retention or growth oriented metrics. And was useful at the time, but the whole idea with the North Star is like, tell me something unique about your product and its strategy. Because if 50 companies could use the same metric framework, that's not really telling what my unique angle is. So it seemed like a perfect way to kind of get people thinking about their product sort of unique value proposition, their unique product strategy, and taking a more holistic idea to measurement and analytics versus, you know, how a lot of startups talk about, you know, what's your end day retention? Another company's like, well, what's your end day retention? And I look at those two companies like, well, you haven't really told me anything. You told me that something you're doing is slightly better than this other company, but you haven't told me what you're doing. So that's kind of the story behind that. We ran a lot of workshops. They seemed to be effective. I joined the company and I was kind of skeptical at first, and I did some of the workshops and they proved to be pretty effective. And we had written about it and we had done all these workshops, and we figured, well, why don't we kind of use this as a frame to talk about what it means to be product led, what it means to be, you know, data informed instead of, you know, myopically data driven. How does product strategy play into this? And then how do you kind of create the glue in the organization? Like, can you speak the same language? So those are some of the themes that we were exploring. And so we wrote the book, and it's been pretty, it seemed to achieve that goal of inspiring people to run a workshop internally and get some of their ideas. I mean, people have sent me extremely elaborate, you know, workshop notes and said, could you review this? And, you know, I do have the day job, but I try to do it. And it's like, wow, they went really deep into it. So
yeah, I can imagine that taking a lot of time. So you kind of mentioned product strategy there. Can you maybe share a little bit about that coherence between the day-to-day tasks that a team does and kind of the the bigger picture?
Yeah, it's funny because strategy is one of those things that people talk about in different ways. And so I'm going to talk about it in the way that I think about it. I mean, to me, strategy is almost like a mental model about, you know, the unique beliefs and bets that you're making as a company on sort of a higher level. So, you know, if an example is you might be viewing the how there's a trend in business to business products to have more consumer grade UX, right? And so that's been going on for a while. So, you know, your strategy might be to latch on to that particular thing. So you've got a belief, you have a belief there's a shift, you might have a belief that it's moving a certain speed, you know, you might have a belief that a general class of ideas are the right thing to do to be able to solve that problem.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I think about strategy, is it's, you know, layering on these beliefs. You think about sports, kind of the same thing. You know, you have a sense, but it has to be very adaptive too. You know, you're going to learn things and to do it. So my sense of a startup is almost, to take the lean startup idea, is that you have a mental model of the world, and that's your product strategy. But then as you learn new things, you're adapting your product strategy to reflect the thing. Now, I think where things get really mixed up though is that, you know, if you were to ask most organizations, like, what are the central beliefs or the product strategy, what's your product strategy? They would start to name features in many cases, or they think, you know, well, our 2020 product strategy is to deliver X, Y, and Z. And that's not really, especially in my model, like that's not really your product strategy. That doesn't tell me much about your unique view of the world or your unique view of the landscape or the climate, you know, that you're operating in. So the North Star framework seeks to kind of create a shortcut for that by, you know, you've got these inputs, which are much more the stuff that we're going to focus on building. And then you've got this North Star, which is sort of in the middle. but it's something in theory that, a salesperson or someone in marketing or someone ever could look at it and be like, aha, like I see if this North Star is going to stick around for the next year, 2 or 3, I see the direction, I see the message that we're trying to create here. Now, what happens in a lot of these workshops, someone says, well, why isn't revenue your North Star? And the easy answer there is that any product manager understands that there's many things you could do to optimize for short-term revenue that are not going to create a sustainable approach to doing it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's strategy is a difficult thing for people to talk about. I tend to view it as like a series of beliefs and bets kind of at a certain level. Yeah. And one of the big anti-patterns is that product will have its strategy, and then the business will have its strategy. And then a sole product leader will be the only one who can act as the translation layer. It's this classic, like, product is the translator of the company. And I tend not to buy into that too much. Like, I think that product should be the catalyst for clear communication between the parts of the company. It shouldn't be like no one understands the product strategy and no one in product development understands the business strategy. But if you just talk to that VP, everything will become clear, right? So I think that that's where the North Star framework comes in, is to attempt to create a common language and one that manifests the product strategy.
Yeah. And so I think, one of the things that I love the name of it as well, the North Star Playbook, because it really kind of hammers home focus, right? Because you can't have 5 North Stars. You have to have a North Star.
Although that comes up in every workshop, by the way. So you need to have 5 North Stars.
Yeah, sure. What are the 5 North Stars? Maybe kind of walk me through how a team who does, and I'm trying to figure out how to word this question, because I don't want to imply that it's good to have more than one North Star, but if you have potentially different lines of business, a broader portfolio, and you have to focus on different metrics for each of those teams, or maybe you're a startup that's at that growth stage where you need to start investing in a new product or a new line of business. How do you reconcile that with the North Star playbook?
Well, it's actually just sort of takes care of itself as long as you're paying attention to the anti-patterns. And I'll explain it this way. Like, let's say you're a bank, and for the purposes of your org chart, you've decided to call 20 things a product. But really, at the end of the day, you're trying to deliver like financial independence, or you're trying to, take care of the financial well-being of people, or, there is a common thread to those products, right? So the anti-pattern in that environment is you come up with 20 products and no one would keep the customer in mind as they went across your product, and you have a very fractured experience, right? So in those settings, I always challenge those companies to be like, no, you don't have 20 products. Then someone will come and say, look, it is very different acting as a brokerage and helping people invest their money than it is their sort of like savings and checking, their checking account, right? Like, and their integrated credit products for that. And, usually I look at them and be like, yeah, you're right. Like you're fulfilling a different need. And then someone will say, well, how about our institutional investors? And I'll say, well, of course that's a different need, right? Like that's bigger. It's a different, I usually go human need, touch point interface. You can slice up a product in many ways, but I try to nudge it down to the humans and the human needs as much as I can, before you have these things. So what I mean by it shaking out in the end is, as long as you challenge these notions, like, is that a great example? I worked at Zendesk. Zendesk is customer support. Now they've gone into these other areas. So now they got involved in like sales, CRM. Now that is, there's overlaps, but that's sufficiently different. You've got this different persona. They've got different needs. That's a different thing. Now within the support world, let's just say you have a chat interface, and then you have a, email support interface, and then you have a help me now, kind of like, here's your help docs kind of thing. You could see how you could go wrong if you didn't understand like the agent experience across those, or you thought about the end user experience. Like, chat bots are just today's approach to solving some problem a little better. We're going to get better over time. So in that environment, again, you challenge the notion. The CRM thing would feel, okay, this should have its own North Star. But, I would be extreme. I'd rather that they go 3 levels deep. So they had a North Star, a series of inputs, and then a set of inputs below that. than they would be to have alternate North Stars, so that, maybe the North Star would be mean time to case resolution. And when someone went to a website and just got the help article, boom, that's really fast.
Yeah.
If you submit a support ticket and it takes 3 weeks to resolve it, that would take 3 weeks, and so everything would work around that. So I think that hopefully that helps. It's about challenging the idea of like over pre-converging on what is a product just for the sake of maybe, sometimes it's packaging and pricing. Really what you're talking about is a different package, and they need to call it a new product because, they want to charge more for it, and people buy products, and they can't just sell the old thing because they can't charge enough for that. So they're like, it's a new product, but that's not.
Right.
It's a new package or something on top of it. It's a value-added service, maybe.
Sure. And maybe kind of walk me through a little bit of where you see the product manager playing when it comes to that strategy. So, I think one of the nice graphics that you have on your blog is the one that kind of calls out the very task level piece of ownership all the way down to the long-term business outcome, kind of the big bet, the foundational stuff. Where do you see the product manager playing? I mean, it obviously bouncing around that to various degrees, but where's the appropriate place in devising that product strategy for the product manager to contribute?
Yeah, it's interesting. This has to do with like larger and smaller organizations and stuff. I mean, one thing I have noticed is that in a startup with one product, prematurely dividing it up into separate value streams can sometimes be detrimental. Like there really is one product manager, and it might even be the CEO, like it might be the person who sees it. And once all these teams, go to the wind and don't interact with each other, you sometimes run into problems at that thing. So I think that in a, it really depends on the culture, the product culture in that organization. I mean, in some organizations, product's primary role in this is like context builder. They're thinking about, the various kind of business threads that exist and the go-to-market threads, and sort of they're deeply understanding the customers in their particular world. And instead of thinking about them playing on one level, they're kind of creating the tissue that lets the team work up and down those levels. Now, in other organizations, it's very much like a VP has set the, general product strategy. And frankly, it's even kind of specific.
Sure.
It's like, we're going to do that. And then the line product manager sort of treats that feature area or something as its own like mini product. And in that sense too, they might be heavily involved in kind of getting the flywheel going with customer feedback, understanding the impact of certain releases. They start taking more of like the analyst and data, like the data hat too, to understand if they're doing that. And then in some other organizations, it's like the product manager is writing all these stories and doing that. I mean, that's the thing with, I give a lot of advice to product managers when they're trying to pick their organization that they work in, but I really caution them against going and working in an organization where they're going to be like a ticket writer and stuff, because the problem with that is that once you invest all your time in that, you're not investing in time talking to the customer. You're not investing time to bringing the customer voice to the team, or actually bringing the customer to talk to the team. What you're doing, a very, very tactical, sort of nuts and bolts IDOT or T-crosser. And the problem is that when you want to go and work at a company that has a more like, it has, engineers and designers are much more eager and excited to get involved, you kind of don't know where you fit in and you don't know. So it's a little bit, even if the organization needs desperately someone to be the ticket writer, I try to tell them to like maybe help for a little while, but try to get out of that business. Like your goal, especially if you've got good designers there, your goal is not to specify, in my mind, to do that. So I don't know, I'm explaining 3 different levels, like the VP and like the person. The problem with product management, again, is that like the principles remain the same, but how it manifests in particular cultures can be very different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that you said that I kind of resonated was the product manager not being the appropriate person to specify per se. Who would that be in most teams that you would say are working effectively?
When you have a UX researcher and you have a designer, And, so they're very skilled at understanding the sort of job to be done or the need of these particular folks. And ideally they're out there talking to the customer as much as product is, right? And then ideally you also have a tech lead, or you have someone, or the whole team really, that I mean, I've worked at companies where the tech leads could probably go to other companies and be product managers at those companies. They're pretty, they've got that sixth sense. They're really good at kind of, thinking about decomposing the problem into the slice that makes sense, while leaving options open and kind of baking in extensibility into what they're doing. So I see that those three sort of forming this kind of, in some companies it's like the three amigos, but whatever you want to call it, like they form this almost organism together that has a mind that's greater than the sum of its parts. Like they're really playing off each other. And so I'm not saying, so what I mean by the requirements thing is that, like, the idea that a product manager would be sitting there, like trying to draw something out in Google Slides, or, trying to like give, specific workflow steps or something like that. Like if the team's able to start together and connect with a customer, designers are really good at that, and tech leads can be really good at that. So that's kind of what I meant by that. But I think an example of where product, like it really depends. Like in specialized fields, sometimes it takes a product manager and a designer working full-time with customers to even build a cohesive mental model, of that world, like healthcare or another thing. Like there's many actors. Like you might have the PM might be extremely good at understanding like the practice coordinator, like persona. And then the designers might be really, really skilled at understanding the practitioner persona. Like that, that gets super complex really, really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of goes back to the concept of knowing the customer really well, and not just being the only person on the team who knows the customer, right? And I think that's something that you've written about as well. Is
I go straight to that. I'm like, who talks to customers, how often, when? And, if it's like only the product manager talks to the customer, designers just do whatever, usually designers kind of do it on the sly. Like they try to reach out to them on the sly, but that's a problem to me. And then when developers never talk to the customer, even if designers and product managers do, I also get worried. Like that's not enough to do that. So you can tell a lot by whether it's insights, like with something like Amplitude, or whether it's just in person, qualitative feedback and stuff. I think you have to. That's one of these things I've read a lot about. And had a lot of conversations about something like product ops or whatever lately. And it seems that in some of these organizations, it's basically, developers need to be left alone to develop, and designers need to be left to do that. And product ops is literally doing voice of the customer, like all the requirements gathering out there in the world. And I think, wow, you're sort of scaling dysfunction here. Like,
Well, it's interesting because I've heard product ops kind of be bandied around a lot more recently, as it kind of becomes a buzzword in the industry. What is your take on product ops? How is it leveraged to do good, and how can it maybe demonstrate some anti-patterns like you've just described?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that, like all these things, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, guaranteed there were teams doing product opsy oriented things and not calling it product ops. They just did it. Right. And so they might have taken one of the three sort of perspectives on product ops. They were either there as kind of, getting the glue, the strategy glue and the insights glue to help the teams, or they might have been, there to like help the teams connect more with customers, or they might have been there as more of like a, purely tools, they ran like user voice, whatever. Like there's many different variations of this. And the whole idea is, again, kind of going back, like, are you scaling something that works or not works, or doesn't work? So the problem that they would have is, a lot of those practices built up in pretty rapidly scaling companies for a reason. And the best people at doing it were trying to think very, very thoughtfully about how do we balance, the need for autonomy and alignment and connection with customers, and where are things falling through the cracks. So instead of trying to invent something new, the product team would look at that and be like, oh my goodness, just keeping up with the stack that we have here is just a full-time job. I mean, just researching and adminning those things and trying to make sure that the data is clean, that takes our PMs, 10% of their time, and then balls drop. Oh, Mary, you seem to really like doing that. Like, why don't you focus on that? And then we'll call it product ops, right? Or something.
Yeah.
Now, the anti-pattern is teams that, are trying to do things at scale. It's just a mess of dependencies, and the teams aren't really teams, and they haven't shipped anything for a quarter, and they think, oh, obviously this is an efficiency problem. We just don't have operations for our product teams. And then what you get is just kind of glomming on all the program management stuff, the portfolio management stuff, kind of project management, all kinds of sort of, they're just amplifying the things that weren't working in a sense, and then just trying to solve it with process. And I think that's where things go a little wrong with that.
How do you, let's say you are in that environment, what's the solution other than process, other than glomming on all those things? How do you get to the root of the problem?
I think it's you've got to create, and this happens in a lot of these large organizations where, they're trying to do scaled agile, or they're trying to do any number of these things. And, maybe that's the right step to kind of stabilize the patient to an extent. But I think that you have to start creating environments where even a small number of teams can approach something without all these layers of dependencies, and with just a little bit more aligned autonomy, to be able to do that. Part of it is just calling the kettle black and realizing where you are and realizing the impact of all those dependencies. A lot of those organizations have so many layers of process, they can't even imagine the world before all the process. They can't really fathom that that's sapping 80% of the thing, or they can't really understand that, like, their yearly roadmap is forcing teams to decide what they're going to build 6 months ahead of time and planning on it. So they just need even to visualize the work. They just need to understand, like, what are they doing right now and what impact does it have? And that sometimes is another way. You can either like create a safe spot for some teams to work in a different way, or you can try to shine the mirror back on the org and set up like continuous improvement kind of, like look the demon in its face, and then just try to like improve what you're doing.
Yeah. And, I think this is also something that's come up in your writing a lot. The continuous improvement muscle, and getting that into the organization, not just on an individual team level, but on a broader basis, and kind of having that self-reflection. What actionable steps would you advise teams to take to implement a continuous improvement muscle?
Yeah, that's so hard because it's so easy to say. It's teams that do retrospectives are the same way. They're kind of like, who doesn't want to do a retrospective? Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Yeah. Do we want to improve? Yeah. But then you ask, and especially with product teams, the product team gets together once a quarter. Oh, everyone, what worked? What didn't work last quarter? Okay, okay. All right, I promise you I'll try to fix those things. And, like another quarter goes by and does that. So there's no silver bullet to it. Like, you have to create the plumbing for continuous. You have to figure out how to, focus your efforts where there's the most pain, run experiments to try to address that area, and then reflect on whether those experiments are working, and then change course. The biggest challenge is that a lot of management cultures promote the idea that managers are managers are there to be the shit umbrella and to kind of, tweak these things behind the scenes to make it better. And then everyone on the team is just supposed to have this idyllic, don't bother me with anything. Now, the challenge there is by not engaging people in what it is, you actually, get a bunch of middle managers running around kind of ineffective at trying to do that. And so the broader you can make the continuous improvement sphere, the more, people are like, oh, that group's too big. But they're, especially with something like liberating structures or other techniques like that, they've done retros with 150 people that have led to actionable things that teams have committed to improve. So you've got different circles of continuous improvement. You've got on the team level, but often there's a level kind of above that encapsulates a couple teams and a couple PMs and a couple, like some architects or whatever. And if you can nudge up to that level, 150 might be really ambitious, but if you can nudge up the sphere of your retrospectives and how you do those things, usually that's beneficial. But there's no easy way. Like, you've got to just commit. You've got to commit to try the things and improve, right? So
awesome.
It's hard.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it is. Well, I want to thank you again for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is great.
Yeah. Can you share just a little bit more about how people in Product 404 can find you?
Sure. Probably I have a 2-year-old. I'm incredibly tired and distracted. So like Twitter is actually a decent way. So John, John, Cuttlefish, Cutle fish on Twitter. And I'm doing you'll see a link there, but for 2020, I'm doing a post a week on Substack. And that goes out as a newsletter. So a couple thousand people on that, and they get that. And then the Medium blog still, I have just overwhelmed with it. There's like 1,000 comments sitting there, and like I don't even want to go through them. Like Medium had a paywall, but apparently you can still find the stuff on Medium and on Cuttle.fish, which was my redundancy plan in case I really like got mad with Medium one day. So kind of it's a mess at the moment, but you'll find me if you're interested in finding me.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.